Late October 2011, Waushara County, Wisconsin. The frost hadn't come yet, but the mornings had that wet, metallic smell that tells a farmer winter is loading its wagon. Tom Halvorsen was 44 years old, standing in the gravel drive of a rented farmhouse outside Watoma, staring at 11 plastic crates somebody had left by his mailbox overnight. Inside those crates were roughly 4,000 eggs. Every single one of them was cracked, checked, or leaking. He hadn't ordered them. He hadn't asked for them. And for a moment, standing there in his barn coat with his coffee going cold in his hand, Tom Halvorsen thought somebody was playing a cruel joke on him. He was wrong. It wasn't a joke. It was the accident that would save his life. To understand why 4,000 broken eggs showed up on a stranger's porch, you have to understand how the egg business actually works. Because most people never think about it past the carton in the grocery aisle. A commercial layer hen barn can hold anywhere from 10,000 to 100,000 birds. Eggs move down conveyor belts to a processing room where they're washed, dried, and then run through a machine called a candler. Candling is an old technique, older than electricity even, where eggs are passed in front of a bright light so a worker, or now a camera, can see straight through the shell. It shows blood spots, double yolks, hairline fractures you'd never catch with the naked eye, and it separates the eggs that are fit for a carton from the eggs that are not. The ones that don't pass are called checks, or leakers, or in the roughest industry slang, seconds. A hairline crack that never leaked, called a check, might still be biologically fine to eat. A leaker, where the membrane itself has failed and albumin is seeping through the shell, is a food safety problem, because that crack is now a door for bacteria like salmonella to walk straight through into the yolk. Most large operations cannot legally sell checks or leakers as table eggs. Federal grading standards under the USDA simply will not allow it. So every single day, tens of thousands of structurally imperfect, but often perfectly edible eggs get pulled from the line. Some large operations have a market for this. They sell it in bulk, in liquid form, to bakeries and food manufacturers who pasteurize it down into egg product. But a lot of mid-size farms, the family operations running 20 or 30,000 birds instead of 1 million, don't have that kind of buyer lined up. For them, cracked eggs are a cost. They have to pay to have them hauled off, composted, or in the worst years, dumped. That's exactly the situation a farm called Prairie Clover Farms found itself in that October. Owned by a family named Jorgensen, 3 generations deep into egg production, they had just lost their liquid egg buyer 2 weeks earlier, when the processing plant in Green Bay shut its doors for a labor dispute. Suddenly, they had a truck full of seconds with nowhere to go, a compost pile already overflowing from the summer, and a hauling contractor who wanted $300 a week to take the problem away. Old man Jorgensen, whose name was Walter, remembered a fact from decades back. There used to be a man 2 farms over who bought seconds for noodle making, back before the interstate came through and changed everybody's supply chains. Walter didn't know if anybody still did that kind of thing, but he had heard, through the Grange Hall grapevine, that a fella named Halvorsen, who'd moved up from Illinois after some hard years, was trying to start a small pasta operation out of his kitchen. Walter never called ahead. He just told his hired hand to drop 11 crates at the Halvorsen place on the way back from the co-op. That was the whole plan. That was the entire birth of what would become, 4 years later, a genuine 6-figure business. Now, to understand what Tom Halvorsen was doing standing in a rented farmhouse driveway in the first place, you have to go back 2 years earlier. Tom had run a mid-sized construction supply business outside Rockford, Illinois, for almost 15 years. It went under in 2009, one of the tens of thousands of small businesses that the housing collapse simply erased. He was divorced by then, his 2 kids mostly grown, and he took what was left of his savings, moved north across the state line into Wisconsin, and rented 40 acres with an old farmhouse, because the rent was cheap and he needed somewhere quiet to figure out what came next. He wasn't a farmer by trade, but he had grown up around a grandmother who made pasta from scratch every single Sunday of his childhood, an old country habit she'd carried from her own mother. Tom remembered her hands, dusted white with flour, working a wooden board on the kitchen table, and he remembered that she always used more egg yolks than any recipe called for, because she said the yolk was what gave pasta its color, its richness, its bite. That memory is exactly what egg yolks do, biologically speaking. A yolk is roughly 50% water, but the rest is packed with fat, protein, and emulsifiers called lecithins. When you work egg into flour, those lecithins bind fat and water together into a smooth, elastic dough, and they're also what gives fresh pasta its glossy sheen and its deep yellow color, especially when the hens producing those yolks have been eating a diet rich in marigold petals or corn, which carry natural pigments called xanthophylls. A pale, thin yolk from a bird on a poor diet makes a pale, forgettable noodle. A deep orange yolk from a well-fed, pasture-raised hen makes pasta that looks like it's lit from the inside. Tom had been experimenting for about 8 months by the time those crates showed up. He had a small stand at the Wautoma Farmers Market on Saturdays, selling maybe $40 of fresh tagliatelle and pappardelle a week, made in batches so small he was buying eggs by the dozen at the regular grocery store, which was murdering his margins. He was maybe 1 bad month away from giving the whole idea up and going back to looking for warehouse work. And then Walter Jorgensen's hired hand backed a truck up to his mailbox. Tom's first instinct, staring at those crates, was that most of the eggs were garbage. He almost called the county to ask about disposal, but he was raised by parents who came up during hard decades, and something in him wouldn't let 4,000 eggs go to waste without at least looking closer. So he did what any careful person would do. He started sorting. He set up a folding table in his kitchen with 2 5-gallon buckets and a headlamp, and he went through crate by crate. What he found surprised him. Maybe 15% of those eggs were true leakers, spoiled beyond any safe use, and those went straight to the compost pile out back, which is itself a piece of good farm biology, since eggshell is almost pure calcium carbonate and breaks down beautifully into garden soil. But the other 85% were checks, hairline cracks, cosmetically disqualified, but the membrane underneath was intact. The eggs inside were fine. They simply couldn't be sold in a carton because a consumer wouldn't buy a dozen with a crack showing. For a man about to close a boutique fresh pasta business, that was not garbage, that was raw material. Tom drove out to Prairie Clover Farms 2 days later, not to complain, but to ask Walter Jorgensen a question nobody had asked him in years. Would you sell me your seconds on a standing weekly basis, and can we agree on a fair price? Walter, by his own later telling in a local newspaper feature, laughed out loud in his own driveway. He said he'd been paying to get rid of that problem for 2 weeks straight, and here was a man asking to pay him for it. They shook on 4 cents an egg, cash, picked up every Tuesday and Friday. It was a fraction of what a dozen grated eggs cost at retail, and for Walter, it turned a liability into revenue. That single handshake deal is the exact hinge point of this whole story. Everything after it is really just what happens when a good idea meets a reliable supply chain. There's a piece of food science worth pausing on here, because it explains why this business model actually worked, rather than being some feel-good story that would have collapsed in 6 months. Fresh pasta dough is typically built on a ratio, something in the range of 1 whole egg per 100 grams of flour, sometimes adjusted with extra yolks for richness. Dried boxed supermarket pasta is almost always made without eggs at all, just semolina and water, because it's built for shelf life and mass production. Fresh, egg-based pasta occupies a totally different, higher margin category. It's the stuff you find at a farmer's market or a specialty Italian shop, selling for $8 to $14 a pound instead of $1.50 for a box of dried spaghetti. That means egg cost is one of the single biggest line items in a fresh pasta business's cost of goods sold. Cutting that cost by more than half, while keeping the exact same quality of yolk, doesn't just improve the margin. It fundamentally changes what the business can become. Tom did something smart almost immediately. He didn't hide the source of his eggs. He leaned into it. His farmer's market sign started reading, "Made with rescued farm eggs," and when customers asked what that meant, he told them the honest story. A neighboring egg farm had cracked eggs they couldn't legally sell, and instead of composting them, he was turning them into something people wanted to eat. In an era when consumers, especially in that 45 to 65 age bracket, who grew up with parents who lived through real scarcity, were becoming more conscious of food waste, that story didn't just sell pasta, it sold a value. Sales at his one little stand nearly tripled within 2 months. By spring of 2012, Tom had outgrown his kitchen. He converted the old dairy parlor on the rented property into a licensed commercial kitchen, a process that took him through Wisconsin's cottage food and dairy processing regulations. No small task for a man with no background in food licensing. He financed a used pasta extruder and a proper flour sifter with a small loan from a local credit union, the kind of community bank that still knew its customers by name. He also formalized the deal with Walter Jorgensen. Instead of loose crates dropped at a mailbox, they built a real system. Every Tuesday and Friday, Tom would arrive with his own coolers, and the Jorgensen family would have that week's checks separated and ready, candled and sorted by their own staff, who by this point had trained themselves to distinguish a true leaker from a superficial check almost by feel. It was, in its own small way, a second income stream for a family egg farm that hadn't had one in a generation. Word moved the way it always does in farm country, slowly, and then all at once. A food writer from a Madison paper did a short piece on him in late 2012, and that article, more than any advertising he could have paid for, is what really turned things. He started getting calls from small restaurants in Appleton and Oshkosh. A grocery co-op in Stevens Point asked to stock his fettuccine. By the end of 2013, he had hired his first 2 employees, both local women who needed part-time, flexible farm-adjacent work, one of them Walter Jorgensen's own daughter-in-law. There were hard stretches. There always are. In the winter of 2014, an avian influenza scare briefly shut down egg movement across several counties, and Tom had to burn through savings to keep his small staff paid while supply caught back up. He learned, the hard way, that building a business on a single supplier's cracked eggs meant he needed a second and third farm relationship as backup, which he built over the following year, eventually working with 3 egg operations within a 30-mile radius. He also had to solve a problem that isn't obvious until you're standing in a commercial kitchen at 5 in the morning. Checked eggs, even good ones, don't keep as long as intact eggs, because that hairline crack, even without a full leak, still allows slightly faster moisture loss and a marginally higher risk of bacterial entry over time. Tom had to build his entire production schedule around fast turnaround, cracking and using those eggs within 48 hours of pickup rather than the week or more a grocery store egg can sit. That constraint, which could have broken a less disciplined operation, actually forced him into a level of freshness that became another selling point. His pasta wasn't just rescued, it was made same week from eggs most people never saw. By 2015, 4 years after those 11 crates showed up unannounced, Tom Halvorsen's business, which he'd named Wautoma Egg Works, was doing just over $500,000 in annual revenue, with a net profit comfortably in 6 figures. He had 7 employees. He supplied more than 30 restaurants and 13 grocery locations across central Wisconsin. He had, by his own account in a later interview, never once bought a fresh egg from a regular commercial grading line again. Every yolk that went into every noodle came from a check, a crack, a reject that some machine in a candling room had decided wasn't good enough for a carton. Walter Jorgensen, well into his 70s by then, told the same reporter something that has stuck with a lot of people who've heard this story since. He said his family had been throwing away money for 30 years without knowing it, and it took a stranger standing at the end of his driveway to see the value in what everybody else called garbage. There's an old, unglamorous truth sitting underneath this whole story, and it's one that generations of farm families have understood better than anybody. Nothing on a working farm is actually waste until somebody decides it is. A cracked egg is not a bad egg. It's simply an egg that failed one narrow cosmetic standard built for a grocery store shelf. The protein is the same. The fat is the same. The color, the richness, the binding power that turns flour and water into something worth savoring on a plate, none of that changes because a shell has a hairline fracture. What changed everything for Tom Halvorsen wasn't luck, even though it looked that way standing in his driveway that October morning. What changed everything was that he was paying close enough attention and had enough respect for the resource sitting in front of him to recognize an opportunity that a whole industry had been throwing in the compost pile for decades. Somewhere out there right now, there's a truck backing up to another dumpster, unloading another few thousand pounds of something a machine decided wasn't good enough. Most of the time, that really is just waste. But every once in a while, standing at the end of somebody's driveway, there's a fortune hiding inside a crack.